Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Professor Hamamoto. The date is May 9, year 2022, and it is 11 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I am pleased to be joined today by the Honorable Michael Shrimpton. His curriculum vitae, his resume, is extensive, and I draw it directly from this incredible account, partly autobiographical, partly intelligence workup on the incredible centrality, which I only knew a little bit about, the centrality of Germany since I guess the time of Bismarck, right? And specifically, and I'm going to attempt this acronym here. It's we'll be calling it DVD throughout this conversation, but it's the Deutsche Verteidigungsdienst. How's
Yes.
that, Mr. Shrimpton?
That's pretty close, yes.
All
I
right.
mean, ich spreche nicht Deutsch, so my German pronunciation is good, but
It's at the high school level. Mr. Shrimpton, welcome. So glad to see you. This book bowled me over. I'm still reeling from its impact.
Okay.
And I do indeed intend on ordering directly from you a copy if you will inscribe it. Will it
certainly inscribe. It's waiting to go out to you in California, Daryl.
Okay, I couldn't wait. I had to order it on the used market. It cost me a lot of money. It's hard to find here in the US. But we can start with that. Why is it so difficult to find your work in print in America?
Well, we don't have an American publisher. The UK publishers, June Press, stopped sending copies to the States directly because of the postage cost, which is over around about £25 UK. That's because of the weight of the book. It's a weighty book, both in terms of, I would like to think it's weighty in terms of its academic rigor, but also weighty in terms of the actual weight. And it's just about a kilo, so 2.2 pounds or thereabouts. And effectively it costs as much to just post the book to America as it does to produce it. Now, the answer, of course, is to have a production run in the States, but I've not had any publisher bold enough so far to agree to do a production run in the States.
Well, the reason I ask is if there are any publishers out there, major trade publishers or,
Yep.
Off-brand, however you want to just independent publishers.
Yeah.
Here's your opportunity.
Yep, I'd be happy to talk to them. I think it would sell well in the States. It does need a new edition. I mean, the second edition came out in 2014. So it needs a new edition. Undoubtedly, it could benefit from better editing and from a more professionally prepared index. But it was written under conditions of great difficulty, where the British government tried to suppress publication and raided my flat, and the police seized all my working copies, my backup copies, and quite a considerable effort was required to retrieve backup copies from offshore, translate them back from PDF to Word, which wasn't so easy in 2014.
This is as recent as 2014. You said.
Yes, and the backup copies were seized. My house was unlawfully raided in 2012 as part of the bogus allegation of the bomb hoax allegation. The police were allegedly searching for evidence of the bomb hoax plot, which they didn't find because there was no plot as such. There was an intelligence operation mounted by the DVD's London station GO2 to blow up the Olympic Games. So there was no crime was being committed. They found a limited amount of information relating to that intelligence operation. There's no evidence of a hoax, of course, but also they were clearly under orders from the Cabinet Office to seize the book. I should explain, Daryl, that in Britain the police report to the Cabinet Office. They're not independent.
I see. And you're referring to the Olympics held in London. And according to the book, there was a threat of a nuclear weapon that was going to be detonated. Would you explain that? And was this have to do with the Official Secrets Act, or just a terrorist threat, or what was the pretext?
Well, the intelligence came. The weapon itself was German. It was originally Russian. It was stolen by the Germans from the Russians when they sabotaged a Russian submarine called the Kursk in August 2000. The Kursk was carrying 4 SSN-19 nuclear warheads. The Germans retrieved all 4 of those underwater. We know the Kursk wasn't being guarded all of the time. The Germans got in there in a fairly technically brilliant operation. They removed the 4 nuclear warheads on the Kursk. 2 of those, I think, were used in 2011 at Fukushima, off the coast of Japan, or off the coast of Fukushima in Japan, and 2 warheads were inserted into London in late 2011, early 2012. The Russians tracked the warheads in, told me they tracked 1 warhead in. I think they missed the first one, tracked the second warhead in, and I was told by a series of cutouts, including that nice man, Ben Fulford in Tokyo.
Mm-hmm. And
So the police are our police, in addition to being lacking independence, our police also lack intelligence, no offense intended. They didn't understand how the world of intelligence works. I said, well, the information has come from Moscow, which it had. They said, well, there are no incoming calls to you from Moscow. I said, well, that's not the way it's done. We went from Moscow to Belgrade, Belgrade to Tokyo, Tokyo to Kent, and Kent to me. You never get this intelligence of that sensitivity. You would never get that intelligence directly.
wow. So the Fukushima Genpatsu, the power plant up there in
Yes.
the Fukushima area. By the way, I went there the year after to try to get some information. I came up with nothing. The most accurate account, according to you, comes from Benjamin Fulford.
Yeah, Ben has got good connections in Japan, and he's got this one right. It was a nuclear attack. The weapons have been modified for underwater detonation. They were installed there by a drilling ship, and the explosion went ahead. The target was Tokyo. The German plan was to wipe out Tokyo by taking down. The plan was, undersea nuclear detonation that creates a tsunami. The tsunami takes down the nuclear power plant, and the nuclear power plant takes down Tokyo. That at any rate was the cunning plan. Fortunately, it failed.
Mm-hmm. Now,
Through some very courageous work, I have to say. The workers at the Fukushima nuclear plant, rather like the Russian workers at Chernobyl in a German sabotage operation some 25 years earlier, were very courageous, and they prevented Tokyo from being irradiated.
Now,
at a cost, in some cases, of their own lives.
Yeah, and you read in the Western press all these negative stories about how they were exploited, but in some quarters they're seen as heroic defenders of the nation, right?
Oh, they were.
Drawn from the underclass. So how, you don't talk a lot about, and it's no fault of your own. I know you have a huge area.
It covers a wide area.
Yeah, it's incredible. But how do you rate contemporary Japanese intelligence entities via, let's say, the lens of a Benjamin Fulford?
They're not too bad, but they're far too secretive. They haven't gone public on Fukushima, and they haven't gone public on the DVD. So they're failing in the sense that they're not really getting on top of the DVD, which has had German intelligence has had powerful influence in Tokyo for decades, going back to Richard Sorge, who was a German asset, false flagged as a Soviet asset in World War II.
Right. There is
the German-Japanese alliance goes way back. I mean, before World War One, the Germans agreed that the Japanese could participate in World War One on the Allied side, essentially in order to gain bases in the Pacific for what became World War Two. So the Japanese made no material contribution to winning World War One. The odd minor operation, a few destroyers in the Mediterranean, but nothing of any great significance. So the Japanese weren't really they weren't on the Allied side at all. They were hoping to replace the British, French, Dutch colonial empires and to beat the Americans. And they were after bases in the Pacific, which they got as a result of their participation in World War One.
Well, could it be that even the contemporary Japanese government is in alliance or at least tacit cooperation with the DVD as a
Entirely
hedge
possible.
against China, England, the colonial powers, in other words, because Germany does not have that extensive of a colonial presence globally
No,
until much later.
Germany lost its colonial presence in 1914 or 19 in World War One, but then got it back again in 1919 under the guise of the League of Nations, which was under German control, and former German colonies were under indirect German control from 1919 on. In 1945, we made the mistake of setting up the United Nations, and the United Nations was under German intelligence control, much as the League was. And where you had UN trust territories, then the Germans were able to retain indirect influence over their government.
Mhm.
So
Well,
both the League of Nations and the UN were complete cons.
okay, we're going to get to the United Nations and NATO, especially since it's relevant to today's conflict supposedly
Yes,
between Russia and Ukraine. I suspect that there's a DVD under the bed there as well.
of course. Yes,
Of
it's really a
course.
conflict in Russia. It's really a conflict. Well spotted. It's really a conflict in Russia and Germany. And
Okay.
Zelensky is essentially a German asset,
It's a
although he was.
proxy war. But let
It's a
me,
proxy.
while it's on my mind, let me clarify this rumor that Vladimir Putin is fluent in German and he's besties with Angela Merkel. He was the
Well,
German intelligence guy, right, for the KGB back then.
he is fluent in. I've not met Vladimir. We were due to meet in 2003, 2005, but he was called away by an earthquake in Siberia. I was attending a conference he was due to address in Moscow. The As far as I know, he is fluent in German. It would be surprising if he weren't, because he was a KGB intelligence officer based in East Germany. So
Mhm.
I'm sure he's fluent in German. He's a very smart man, and I'm told a very nice man too by those who know him.
Mhm. But he was also tight with Merkel. That's the other part of the
Well,
rumor.
there were conversations between Angela and President Putin. I wouldn't say that they were tight,
Okay.
um, but it was a Mexican standoff because President Putin, who's both smart and well informed, as well as nice, would be aware of Merkel's background with the DVD, her father's connection to the DVD, and he had something of a hold over Angela.
Okay. And it should be noted that Angela Merkel is the only prime minister or president or head of state who has held the PhD in physics.
Yes, I think that's right. She wasn't head of state, of course. She was Chancellor of Germany. The head of state
Okay.
of Germany is
I'm
the
sorry.
president,
Yes.
although he's usually a figurehead, a bit like the American president. The president of Germany is normally a figurehead with no real power. The But yes, I think that's right. She has
Okay, let's
a great.
pivot to a topic of great interest to us here in America. Was the recent election of Joseph Biden, was that a DVD operation?
Yes, that was run out of Frankfurt. Technically, it was a career group operation, but the career group were part of the DVD. The career group was set up by a German spy called Gordon Career, who at one point I think was DA in Manhattan. He set up the career group. It's based in Frankfurt, Germany, and its main purpose in life is to control the FBI and the CIA. It has assets in most American intelligence agencies. Um, but the career group is the part of the DVD which runs American intelligence. Um, and it was the career group that did the actual operational, they had actual operational control of the rigging of the 2020 election.
Okay, and do you have any intel on how that was done from a technical standpoint?
Yes, a lot of it was done by these voting machines. The Dominion voting machines were open to the internet, and the interference on those machines was run from a server farm in Frankfurt, which the Pentagon then raided. But the Pentagon then went quiet which was complete madness. Complete madness, because it meant the American Constitution was being overturned. The man who was elected president wasn't installed as president, and um, and the Pentagon just went along with it, which is, I say, a bit nonsense.
Now, the Pentagon went along with it. Is it because they have been, the Pentagon itself has been penetrated by the
They've
DB?
got major problems with penetration. Absolutely, yes. I mean, if you go back to the Vietnam War, one of the reasons why you guys came second to the Vietnam War, sadly, is because the US McNamara, who was the US Secretary of Defense, was a German asset.
Hmm.
So you had a German asset running the American,
Well, that makes sense
determining
because
US policy in Vietnam.
he was a president of the Ford Motor Company.
Exactly.
Ford Motor Company had a presence in Weimar Germany and through the Third Reich. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Most of the trucks that the Wehrmacht used to invade the Soviet Union were made by Ford in Cologne. And indeed, Ford were repaid after the war by the US government for the damage done to its factories in Germany, which is a bit silly when you think about it.
Mhm.
since they
And by the way,
since they were working, since they were manufacturing trucks for the enemy, they weren't manufacturing trucks for you guys.
right. Robert Strange McNamara, by the way, grew up not far from here in the San Francisco Bay Area.
Strange was an eponymous name for him. He was a strange individual, strange by name, strange by nature.
He's a strange love, that's for sure. But
Oh,
you
yes.
know, his son Craig McNamara has remade himself into a yeoman farmer, not far from where I am here.
Oh.
So that should be a tip off for the next point of attack will be the agricultural lands and the
I didn't know that. I've only ever looked at Robert McNamara. I haven't looked at his son.
Well, the fruit doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?
But usually not. Usually it does not.
But to me, it signals a different type of warfare. You're talking about accurately, I believe, and exhaustively about classic kinetic warfare.
Yes.
My contention is, and I went to UC Davis, where most of this has been engineered in the med school, and the primarily agricultural colleges in the United States are the real important ones. Not your Yales, your Harvard. It's the land grant schools that have ag schools, and that's directly connected to the U.S. military, ROTC, all of it. Right. It comes under Pentagon. Yeah. So my contention is that we've already moved into an era from kinetic warfare to genetic warfare. Well, this is where Craig McNamara comes in.
There are arguments in favor of that analysis, yes. And we see the Chinese waging, the Chinese waging bio warfare with their COVID bioweapon, developed with German and Ukrainian technical assistance.
And to your point about the DVD, Monsanto, which is at the forefront of genetic warfare, which declared bankruptcy, was absorbed by Bayer.
Yes.
It has a headquarters not far from UC Davis.
Very, very close connections. It grew out of IG Farben.
Mm-hmm.
That made the gas for the concentration camps. Yes. Okay. And had very close connections to the Abwehr and German intelligence. Yes, indeed.
Right. Now let's take it back to your college years, just so people get a sense of who Michael Shrimpton is, how he started out. Some people have a mistaken impression of you, myself included, because I only knew you through YouTube, but I read your backstory.
Right.
And you I don't call you a classical liberal. You referred to yourself as sort of like a neocon, right? You started on the left.
Yes, I started
on the left. You moved, you know, like we all do.
Yeah, well, if you're not, as George Orwell said, if you're not a socialist at the age of 18, you don't have a heart. If you're still a socialist at the age of 30, you don't have a brain.
That's true. But
so in my youth, I was quite liberal and left wing. Absolutely, yes, a bit like Dick Cheney. Yeah.
All right, but you took up the cause. You were the head of the student union.
Yes,
and you took up. This is the University of Cardiff. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, yeah. And you took up the cause. You didn't have to, but you took up the cause of a young man, a fellow student named Atale. Am I pronouncing his name correctly?
Atale. I think Atale Bissell. Yes.
Please explain that particular, and it got you on the road. I know you like to travel anyway, but tell us that story. It's really
Well, it
fascinating.
did get me on the road. This all goes back. I was elected president of the Students' Union at University, what was then University College, Cardiff, in 1981. So I read law. I got my law degree in 1981, and then I became the president of the Students' Union. And we had a very large Turkish student population. Uh, there were various reasons for that. The college had been advertising for places in Turkey. Cardiff had a good reputation in engineering, and one of the students, one of our Turkish students, was Atalay Pisil, who was reading for an engineering degree, and he had been sponsored by the Turkish Post Office. And we had a very active Turkish students' union. And as president, I was committed to trying to integrate the overseas students with the domestic students. So I certainly reached out to all of the overseas student groups, including the Turkish Students' Union. And they came to me when one of their members, Atalay Pisil, was arrested and prosecuted for breaching the terms of his visa. Now, the problem was that there had been a military coup in Turkey, as you will recall, and Daryl, and President Evren, or General Evren, had taken over. That caused chaos, and the supply of funds to Turkish overseas students temporarily dried up. It was clear to me that he should never have been prosecuted, that he was in no way at fault. He couldn't renew his visa until he enrolled for the next year at UC Cardiff, but he couldn't enroll until he paid his fees, and his fees were being paid by the Turkish Post Office, who were his employer or who were sponsoring him. So it wasn't his fault. It was quite outrageous to prosecute him, and it was also clear that this was a temporary interruption to the flow of funds, and the Turkish government, it was very clear that Turkish overseas students weren't going to be left in the lurch, and General Evren would arrange for the funds to be forthcoming. But he was prosecuted, hauled in front of the beak, the subhenry magistrate in Cardiff, Sir Lincoln Hallinan. He wasn't a racist, but he didn't like Turks. And he sent poor Atalay down for 6 months, which I thought was, well, he shouldn't have been prosecuted in the first place. I thought 6 months was excessive. So the Turkish students came to me. I arranged for a telex to be sent from the student union to President Evren in Turkish. I still recall the surprise of the British telecom operator. They had an arrangement whereby you could send a telex through BT and they would pass on any reply. And I thought a telegram or a letter was too slow. So we sent the president a telex. And of course, he's the president of Turkey. So I sent it in Turkish. And it was phrased diplomatically. At the same time, NATO were in delicate negotiations with the new military government about some missiles. I managed to draw a link between the two. President Evren came good. And poor Atalay was beaten up by a bunch of racists in Cardiff prison. In those days, Turkish newspapers were very unusual for those days, in that the front pages of the main Turkish papers were in color. And I managed to get a photographer into the prison, which took some doing, but we got his bruises photographed. They came out rather nicely on the front page of a Turkish newspaper. The Home Office, the Foreign Office got involved. There were discussions about the missiles and NATO. The next thing we knew, a black rover had driven down from London to the prison, and he was released and was able to resume his studies. His family were very grateful and invited me to spend some time with them in Izmir, which is where he was from. And the only problem is I was a student. I wasn't earning very much money. In fact, the cabinet office had jacked up overseas student fees whilst I was at college in the hope of depriving me of my degree. I've been targeted basically since I was targeted from the time I landed back in England in 1978. The files on me in the cabinet office go way back.
You had been living in Australia with your family.
I've been living in Australia with my parents. I actually had a file with the Vatican, and I've been to see the Pope in '75 at a general audience, Pope Paul VI. I had a Vatican file, and I had a file with the Cabinet Office in Britain and obviously with German intelligence. And without blowing my own trumpet, the reason I had a file is because my IQ was tested at school and it was off the charts, and I was seen as a threat. The last thing the Germans wanted was somebody with a brain getting involved in perhaps intelligence work in Britain or politics. And I should explain that in Britain, normally only dumb people are allowed to participate in politics. So I was a marked man, and they tried to start, and very considerable pressure was applied to the Department of Education to make sure that students who were already going through their courses were hit with these outrageous increases. But as president, as the Students' Union, we weren't just there to look after the interests of students like Atelier. We were there to look after, we had commercial operations as well, and one of them was a travel agency. And our travel agency, we sold the most rail tickets of any university in Britain in a particular year, the year I happened to be president. And as a thank you, I was offered a free return rail ticket to anywhere in Europe. And I said, "Oh, how far can I go?" They said, "Turkey." I said, "Right, great." We're off to Istanbul. So I went off to Istanbul on what was originally the Orient Express, which by 1982 had been reduced to through carriages from Paris that were hooked onto a train at Belgrade that started out from Munich. So it wasn't very glamorous or luxurious. And indeed, getting food on the train was a bit problematic. It was a 3-day journey. I couldn't get any food at Sofia station in Bulgaria, because although it stopped for an hour in Sofia, which was a lovely station, I couldn't buy any food because I didn't have any Bulgarian currency. And in those days, you couldn't get Bulgarian currency very readily outside of Bulgaria. And I didn't have any dollars with me. And I was dependent on very nice Turkish guest workers returning from Germany to Turkey. Were kind enough to share their food with me. Otherwise, I'd have been half starved by the time I arrived in Istanbul. And then I hopped on a coach and went down to Izmir and stayed with Adelaide's family, which was nice.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, what really astounded me, because I've never even done it once, but Mr. Shrimpton has traversed the United States of America 4 times at last count by automobile.
Road.
Pardon me?
Yes, by road, 4 times by road and once by rail. 91, I took a trip from New York to San Francisco, Oakland. I should explain for the you guys in California know where Oakland is, but most people think of the train journeys ending in San Francisco. It doesn't. The train actually ends in Oakland terminus, or did then, and you then get on a bus. Yeah. It still does. You then get on a bus for San Francisco, and I was going from New York to San Francisco. I was actually going from London to Australia for my brother Paul's wedding in Tasmania, and I was flying from San Francisco on Continental, first class. Well, they had very, very good service with Continental in the old days. Now they're mixed in with United. The standards of service have gone down to United levels. No offense intended to United, and it's not quite as good. 1991, first class in Continental was a very pleasant experience. And I took a train. I had a first class sleeper on what the Amtrak called the Superliner, and caught the California Zephyr from Chicago to Oakland. And prior to that, the night before, came in from New York on the Broadway Limited, which is sadly no longer in service. But the Broadway Limited was a great experience. But the Superliner trains I found very comfortable, shower and so on. It was great fun. Mm-hmm. I discovered Tom Clancy. I was looking. I had a couple of hours. I nipped up to the Sears Roebuck, the top of the Sears Roebuck Tower, because I wanted to see that. Because then the tallest building in the world, Chicago. And I had an hour or 2 to spare at Chicago Union Station. So I needed some reading for the 3-day journey on the Zephyr, and popped into a bookshop and bought a book by Tom Clancy, which looked interesting. And then he became one of my favorite authors. Okay. Sadly, murdered in 2013 by the DVD. I think, sadly, in order to stop him meeting me. Yes, it was that was a tragedy. It really was, because we weren't actually due to meet. both happened to be members of the United States Naval Institute, who published his first book, Red October.
Mhm.
And I was flying in for the space conference where I met the captain of the mission commander Apollo 13, who was kind enough to endorse his book for me. I think it's in another room, another bookcase. And it was thought that Tom Clancy would be going to the space conference. And in fact, he wasn't scheduled to be there, and we weren't going to meet. But he was murdered, staged heart attack, on the morning I flew in.
Now, is the
I
space
don't think
conference?
that's a coincidence. Sadly, he was a good man. I was very upset about that. Not as upset as poor old Tom Clancy was, but
Right.
that seemed to be particularly egregious of German intelligence to knock off Tom Clancy.
Now, was this space conference sponsored by NASA by any chance?
No, it wasn't. It was sponsored by the US Naval Institute. May I step away from the screen for a moment? And
Please, yes, yes.
Yeah, many people associate the astronauts with the Air Force, but in fact, many of the astronauts came from the US Navy. One of them was a lovely man called Jim Lovell, and that's his signature.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's one of that was one of my that's a book out of my library. It's a standard textbook on US naval aircraft. Jim Lovell was a naval aviator, and anyone knows anything about aviation knows that naval aviators are the best, basically because they have to be, because if you're not very good, you don't last very long.
Mhm.
Since naval aviation is not easy, having flown onto an aircraft carrier myself and flown off one, I understand all that. And I met Jim Lovell. He was kind enough to sign my book for me. I also met Tom Stafford and several American astronauts, all lovely people.
Now, you made the assertion that two of the space shuttle voyages might have been staged accidents
They
with
were
the
they were sabotaged.
oxygen
Challenger and
risk.
Columbia.
Yeah,
Yeah. Both
explain.
both both shuttles were sabotaged. It was done by the DVD. The Germans had maneuvered into the post of vice president and eventually president a nasty piece of work called George Herbert Walker Bush. Some of your listeners will have heard of him. He was the son of a notorious German spy, Senator Prescott Bush, and the younger brother of the head of German intelligence in the United States, who was Prescott Bush Jr. It was a low-profile Bush. He was of the branches of the family, as it were, mixing metaphors. Prescott Bush Jr. was the one who attracted very little attention. Now, Bush, who jumped all over me several times, Bush was in charge of NASA, and as vice president, because NASA tend to report to the vice president, not the president, and it was Bush who was involved in organizing the sabotage of the first space shuttle to go down, which was done. It was very nasty. The German DVD have a specialist sabotage section, and they picked up the fault on the O-rings, and essentially they made sure that the shuttle was launched in conditions which were likely to lead to disaster, and that's what happened. And they pushed this idea of the teacher Terry McAuliffe going on board because they wanted to increase the impact on kiddies. American children were very upset because there was a huge interest in schools across America in the first teacher in space. So she was effectively a trophy victim. The Germans wanted to increase the psychological impact. It's a standard German practice, murdering children for the psychological impact. It was done at the start of World War II when they arranged for children to be placed on board the liner Athenia, which was then torpedoed, and the Germans brought down the Lusitania, again, with children on board deliberately, and on the Titanic. So the Germans love murdering kiddies, I'm afraid. It's very sad. German people don't believe in murdering children, but German people don't run Germany. German
Right.
intelligence runs Germany.
Now,
Germany is an intelligence agency with the state attached.
well, that was an interesting, profound observation that I picked up from your book. the assertion that Germany was the first state founded as an intelligence agency rather than or entity
Yeah,
rather than the other way
exactly.
around.
Yes, the state was merged by German intelligence in the 1840s. The preliminary work had been done years before, and essentially, German intelligence chose the chancellor, not the other way round. So either the chancellor was an intelligence officer like Bismarck, in which case he basically selected himself, or the chancellor was installed by German intelligence, like Adolf Hitler, who was an intelligence officer in World War One, and was installed by Admiral Canaris. And then when Adolf Hitler, what Canaris didn't realize, it's all in my book, what Canaris didn't realize or didn't count on was Adolf Hitler setting up his own intelligence agency with Heinrich Himmler in charge, effectively the SS. So he had his own elite bodyguards, his own intelligence agency, and they arranged for when he invaded Austria, he basically seized the Austrian gold reserves, 11 metric tons, and all of a sudden the Nazis were no longer financially dependent on the empire. And Canaris then tried to assassinate Hitler in 1939, realizing he'd lost control, failed, tried to stop World War II because he could see it was going to lose, was unable to stop it. The Germans went ahead and lost. And Canaris was frantically trying to have Adolf bumped off various times throughout the course of World War II, but never actually managed it.
Now, how
It was
is it?
quite fun. It was quite fun. It was quite funny, really.
Yeah, I guess in a perverse sense. How is it
Yeah. It's
then?
not funny if you're not funny if you're German. Your house was bombed by the RAF or the US 8th Army Air Force.
Yeah, it's total warfare, and of course,
Yeah,
studied by the U.S. bombing survey to gauge the maximum traumatization of populations to ring in the United Nations and one world government, which brings in your literary people, right? The person who wrote the Age of Anxiety, right?
yes.
And people like T.S. Eliot. I wanted to ask you about him. He's originally from St. Louis, which has a really large German population. It's a brewing area. Germans are expert as brewing, and I think that's how
Oh,
they got into China and
German beer
Japan.
is very good. I've always enjoyed a glass of German beer.
So where does the brewery connection come in? Schlitz and Stroh's throughout the American Midwest and the Coors company, Coors
Well, the
family.
German, well, the Germans understood the importance of the United States, which is why they backed the South in the Civil War. They wanted to break up the states. So the South, was a little bit like the Russia-Ukrainian war. It went on for much longer than it should have done, because the more powerful country, in this case the North, was facing an opponent receiving significant overseas support, in this case from Prussia. So the Southern military strategy was largely determined by Prussian military advisors. And then, of course, at the end of the war, the Prussians arranged for your President Lincoln, fine man, to be assassinated, Booth being a Prussian asset. And having failed to destroy America, or at least break it up, the Germans realized that America was going to be more powerful than Germany. It was certainly going to have a larger population, a bigger industrial base, and that meant, at the end of the day, larger armed services. So the Germans came up with a cunning plan of exporting large numbers of Germans, many of them criminal types, like the chap who ended up getting involved in the kidnap of the Lindbergh baby.
Bruno
They exported,
Hauptmann.
yeah, Hauptmann, yeah. A large number of the Germans offloaded a large number of criminals to the United States, but they offloaded a large number of intelligence officers, bankers, and so on. And then you had some very, very powerful assets like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller, who built up very
Warburg.
powerful, built up very powerful positions in America. These are all people reporting to German intelligence. And the Germans had built up very significant control over the United States by the outbreak of World War I, including control of the Federal Reserve Bank, or Federal Reserve System, for which they needed to sink the Titanic, because they needed to offload the three key financiers who were on board the Titanic, who were opposed to setting up the Federal Reserve, which was under German control, and then controls offshore high yield trading, which is how the Germans funded World War I and World War II, and set up the Great Depression. So the German influence over the States has been enormous. They helped the South in the Civil War. They organized depressions, recessions. They assassinated Lincoln, McKinley. Then went on to assassinate John F. Kennedy in 1963. So they've been involved in three major assassinations of U.S. presidents. They installed their asset Colonel House in as an advisor to President Wilson. Made sure that Germany got out of World War I pretty much unscathed, because the terms of the Versailles Treaty were largely drawn up by Germany and agreed to by German assets, including David Lloyd George. Wilson, who cut a deal with the Germans behind the backs of Britain and France, although he wasn't a German asset, he was closely advised by Colonel House, who was. But the Germans had huge influence over the Wilson administration. At the League of Nations was their idea, controlled by Germany from the beginning, controlled by Germany throughout. And then the Germans set up the Great Depression, and then, of course, organized World War II.
Okay. Now, there's one aspect.
Oh, by the way, the Germans were involved at Pearl Harbor, as I explained in my book.
Yes,
there were German pilots at Pearl Harbor.
And later on, the ex-Luftwaffe showed up in Southeast Asia in the Malaysian crisis, so-called. Is that right?
Oh, in the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War.
Yes, the German strategy for forcing the Germans had a twofold strategy for forcing America to lose the Vietnam War. The first part of the strategy involved installing McNamara as Secretary of State for Secretary of Defense. He was reporting to. He was appointed by another German asset called Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was the president, having taken over from Kennedy after Kennedy was assassinated by the Germans.
By the way, he's from the state of Texas, which had a huge 1848 group of Germans that colonized the U.S.-Mexico border.
LBJ, there are deep family connections, I have no doubt, between the German colony in Texas and the LBJ family. LBJ came from a fairly well. In fact, his boys were on the grassy knoll. One of the teams of shooters that assassinated the president. Although I don't think a bullet from the grassy knoll actually hit the president, as opposed to hitting the windshield of the Lincoln. So the Germans were involved. The Germans get controlling LBJ. LBJ appoints McNamara. McNamara screws up American strategy in Vietnam. Completely ludicrous directives. For example, the best fighter, which the Germans largely designed, the MiG-21. So the best fighter the North Vietnamese Air Force had was the MiG-21. It was agile, but it didn't have particularly good missile. The best American fighter of the Vietnam War was the F-4 Phantom, originally a naval fighter that was then taken over by the US Air Force in the air as the F-4E. The Phantom wasn't particularly agile, but it had several wonderful missiles, including the Sparrow, and an excellent radar, which the MiG-21 didn't have. They had radar. So the Germans came up with the cunning idea of saying that American pilots could only engage at visual range. In other words, the rules of engagement for the US Air Force and US Navy and US Marine Corps in the Vietnam War were determined by German intelligence in order to maximize American losses and increase the possibility of the North Vietnamese Air Force getting hits. Now, that was one side of the strategy. So force the Americans to fight on North Vietnamese terms. And the other side of the strategy was to get Luftwaffe pilots trained in America so they would understand American tactics and know the capabilities of American fighters, like the F-4, and then have them fly for the North Vietnamese Air Force. This is a strategy that they had done successfully in the Korean War, where they flew MiG-15s. In the Vietnam War, they were flying MiG-19s which was supersonic, not as good as the MiG-21. The MiG-21 was a Mach 2 capable aircraft, and you had German pilots flying them. I congratulated one. There's no point, Daryl, if you're talking to the opposition, occasionally talk to the opposition. If I'm talking to Jerry, I'm not impolite. And I congratulate, I was talking to a former Inspector General of, well, he was then the Inspector General of the Luftwaffe, who'd flown for the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War and shot down 3 B-52s. So I knew this. The Chief of the Air Staff didn't. I think it was Peter Squires from memory. The Chief of the Air Staff didn't. I did. And I'm having a little drinkies in Whitehall with the German General and the Chief of the British Air Staff. And I said, oh, by the way, General, congratulations on those 3 B-52s. He went white as a sheet. The Chief of the Air Staff said, what B-52s? They're the ones he shot down over Hanoi.
Just out of curiosity, where were the German pilots trained in the U.S.? Was this down in Texas?
It was indeed down in Texas, yes, as it happens.
Okay. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Shrimpton's not blowing smoke. He has 10 pages of sources. His bona fides are impeccable. He's talked to many of these, the principal participants that he's talking about, unlike the secondary, tertiary, so-called research that you find on YouTube. He's the real deal. So anyway, I just, for those who haven't read your book, and they need to read the book, I hope you find an American publisher.
Well, I hope sales will increase. I hope because it hasn't sold widely. It's only sold about 1,000 copies, and that's because it's an intelligence textbook, but it's written for the general reader. So you don't have to be an intelligence officer to read it. And I try and write in an approachable, humorous style. I like to inject the odd bit of humor.
There's an arch underlay of humor there, what we know as British humor. It's wry,
exactly.
But it's there. And if you can make the enemy laugh, he's less inclined to murder you, I think, right?
Well, that's true. That's also true.
And then Oscar Wilde said something to that effect.
Yes, you might have liked my description of the Gestapo.
Oh, we had a sitcom here, about Nazi concentration camps. It's called Hogan's Heroes.
Oh, love Hogan's Heroes.
Oh, you do? Okay. I know you're an American TV freak. I Love Lucy happens to be one of your faves.
Yes, I love that. Again, I would have to step away from the screen, but let me step away from the screen.
Please, please.
The collector's edition.
Oh, yeah.
The collector's edition of Hogan's Heroes. Now I've got all the tapes. Obviously, I bought them when before streaming and DVDs. I've got all the.
You are officially an aficionado of Hogan's Heroes.
I am. I love the show. Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz and Newkirk and LeBeau. And of course, I've written about it in my book because Bob Crane, who played Hogan, who upset the Germans, was then murdered by the Germans in Arizona. So the actor who played Colonel Hogan was murdered by German intelligence.
Right. Well, the way we read it, he was a sex pervert taping all these sexual encounters. But you're saying it was an intelligence operation.
It was an intelligence operation, but the sex pervert angle was also a smear. He was basically set up. So they destroyed his character and then they murdered him. He wasn't a sex pervert, but he just happened to like sex. Well, that's not the same as being a pervert. He had sex with women, which is fine. I'm gay, so I don't. But to each their own. And if you like sex with women, great. There's no law against it as long as they're adult women. And he had sex with women. Well, fine. He was a heterosexual. There's no reason why he shouldn't have had sex with women. He wasn't at all times married to them, but it was not. Right. There's hardly, in the modern day and age, there's hardly anything to write home about. The important thing, Daryl, is that he did not frighten the horses. And what he did was legal, and or mostly, and it really wasn't perversion at all. That was the setup.
Right. Well, the way it was portrayed, like in the National Enquirer, which you know is
Oh,
an intelligence organ, right? Is
the
that
national.
DDD too? Tell me. No.
Well, it probably has an influence over the National Enquirer. Anything written in the National Enquirer, I always take with a pinch of salt. Uh, I mean, it's not as bad as the Washington Post or the New York Times, but it's still not a particularly reliable journal.
Yeah, that was went intel under Generoso Pope, Gene Pope Jr., I believe, but I never knew which country was behind it. I always thought it was CIA. Typically here in America, we look to British intelligence or
Yeah,
CIA. We never look at
for the
DVD.
Germans.
Yes.
Exactly. Well, that's
So
because they
you have
that.
revolutionized our historiographic
Thank you,
understanding of the modern world, the
thank you.
geopolitical world.
And I've had an influence behind the scenes,
Okay.
but not with the public, because the public don't know about the book,
Well,
because
that's going to change
the
after
media daren't talk
today.
about the book.
That's going to change after today. And if you do an American
Right.
edition, I volunteer to write the forward for you.
Oh, that could be quite helpful. Incidentally, well, I'll tell you what, you could. I'm happy to get a doctorate by publication, so I need an academic referee.
Okay. Well, I'm your man there, right?
Thank you. Well,
Professional.
I
I know
shall
how
come
you are
knocking.
about professional courtesy, so I extend one to you in my
That would
limited
be.
capacity.
I am
But
a great believer, Daryl, in professional courtesy.
you are.
Even to the DVD, when there was a very nice DVD officer. Now, MI6 didn't like him because he had their bloke shot. Because I said to MI6, look, boys, his job, he was the head of East German intelligence. Well, he was the head of the HVA. His job was to get your bloke shot. You can't complain about the opposition spy master if he's getting your bloke shot when that's his job. He's just doing his job. But and he didn't shoot. He didn't have them all shot. Somebody had interrogated. Uh, but he was a nice man called General Obus Marcus Wolf, who
Marcus
was,
Wolf,
yes,
East
he
Germany.
was,
He came to the US. Did he
yes,
not?
he did. Of course
Tell
he did.
us. Explain.
Yes, well, he came to the US to help you guys in the war on terror. Marcus was, I got on well with Marcus. I like Marcus. In fact, the Russians, when I came back from that meeting conference in Moscow 2005, I came back to East Berlin on the Moscow Express. So I'm barreling through Moscow, through Russia and Byelorussia on the Moscow Express, which is running to time, and for once, and the and I'm setting up a lunch in East Berlin for Marcus Wolf, and the Russians are monitoring my phone calls. And they're thinking, what the hell's going on? Yeah, Michael's fixing up a lunch with Marcus. And I had Marcus Wolf's home telephone number in East Berlin. Now, I didn't get that out of the East Berlin telephone directory. Of course, the Rozzers, our affectionate term for the police, the Rozzers at Thames Valley Police, when they seized my address book, had the number for home telephone number, East Berlin, General Marcus Wolf, and they just thought I got it out of the phone book. Well, I didn't get Marcus's number out of the East Berlin telephone directory. And you may as well ring up Bell Atlantic. They thought I got the numbers for the Situation Room at the White House, because they're querying my intelligence credentials. So here, boys, wrap yourselves around these numbers. These are numbers for the Situation Room at the White House, and here's a couple of names for the Situation Room. You get hold of the White House, verify the numbers, and they'll tell you who I am. And they'll also tell you that if this guy has got our names and numbers, then he is a serious individual. You do not get a number for the Situation Room at the White House by ringing Bell Atlantic and directory inquiries. The Rozzers didn't, it went over their head. They just assumed I'd got the numbers from Bell Atlantic telephone inquiries. Now, I liked Marcus. MI6 didn't, but that was their problem. I liked Marcus. More to the point, Marcus had been shafted by another faction in the DVD. The great thing about the DVD is it's run by, it's Germans. So the personalities are not necessarily the nicest. And it's riven with factions. And the faction that Marcus wasn't in, which was a faction close to Bush Senior, had ratted on Marcus. Marcus was in a faction that was supportive of the original director of the DVD, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. So Marcus was close to Canaris. Indeed, when he came to London, I arranged for him to meet Canaris's old secretary. And it was lovely because they knew each other and hadn't seen each other since the end of World War II. It was very moving. And but
You
also
witnessed
said,
this,
oh, I witnessed. Yeah, I set it up.
and you were present when the
I
reunion.
introduced them.
Oh my gosh, that's not
I
in the
said,
book, I
"Hello,
don't think.
Marcus. You
Yeah.
haven't seen Inga for many years. Meet Inga. Inga, you'll know Marcus, of course." I mean, there was that sort of conversation. And MI6 were gobsmacked because they had Marcus down as a communist, which is absolute nonsense. He was intelligent. You can't be a communist and intelligent, as you know, Daryl. Either you're intelligent or you're a communist. You can't be both. And an intelligent communist is a bit like a pregnant man. It's just, it poses conceptual difficulties. And I got on quite well with Marcus. And because he'd been ratted on over his pension, and I think they'd tried to get him arrested. I mean, the Bush faction had jumped all over Marcus, which was a huge mistake because he possessed, although he was retired, he possessed an enormous quantity of information. We were getting intelligence out of Marcus. I got Marcus to verify that Edward Heath, former British Prime Minister, was a German agent,
Hmm.
and Marcus obviously knew this. He was a bit surprised that we knew, but he confirmed in the presence of two MI6 officers, one of whom knew about Heath and one didn't, and the one who didn't nearly fell off his chair. And I got on well, Marcus. He liked the scotch, and I would buy him a drink. And when he died, I formally contacted the German embassy in London to express my condolences. I was the only person in the whole United Kingdom ringing to express condolences. But it was a courtesy to the opposition, but I meant it. He was a serious professional. He was extremely good at what he did. And he happened to be a very pleasant individual to deal with, unless you happen to be in one of his prisons in the old days in East Germany, in which case he could be a little bit tough. But that was his job. He was East German spy master. He wasn't running the Mothers Union. He was running basically running the Stasi. He wasn't the official head of the Stasi. That was General was it Malka related. But he was running HBA, which is the foreign
Okay.
intelligence agency or the foreign intelligence arm of the Stasi.
Mhm.
It
Let's move
wasn't.
back to,
It'll come to me in a minute. It wasn't Malta who ran the Stasi.
I think I could look it up in this book by, I don't know if you think it's any
It's in
good.
my book. It's in my. I'll have to look
Yeah.
it up. It's in my book. I have
Okay.
many thousands of names to remember, and I can't always remember them.
Tons of notes, very well documented. Let's move
Thank you.
back to Prime Minister Edward Heath and his compromise situation. You
Yes.
state right out front he was involved with pedophilia, which
Oh
is
yes.
very much in the news today, currently,
Yes.
right? So could you
Yes.
fill us in on his background and how it articulates with figures such as Jimmy Savile of the BBC
Yep.
and the whole the Lavender Mafia that ran the pop music business, including Brian Epstein?
Yes. Now, Jimmy Savile, well, Edward Heath is a German agent. He was recruited in 1937. He was fixed up with a very nice rent boy working for the Germans, who accompanied him to the Nuremberg Nazi Party rally, where he met Adolf Hitler and the nice rent boy, who later became a friend of mine, witnessed the first meeting between Adolf Hitler and Edward Heath, and Heinrich Himmler invited him to drinks party. So Edward Heath is one of the few people I ever met who had been invited to drinks by Heinrich Himmler. Not everybody got invites from Heinrich to a drinks party. Some of them got invites, but they weren't for drinks. And Heath, who was short of money, his parents were not terribly wealthy. Heath was brought up by the Abwehr, but also compromised sexually over his attraction for teenage boys. And he was therefore very much a German agent by the time he rolled up to the party rally in Nuremberg. In 1939, Heath tried to stop the German invasion of Poland and was involved in last-minute negotiations between Admiral Canaris in Berlin and the British ambassador in Warsaw. Now, he was on a camping holiday in Nazi Germany with Madron Seligman, who was my opponent, Tory opponent, in the 1989 West Sussex European Parliament elections. And it was Madron who first put me onto Heath. Unintentionally, he lied. He told me about this camping trip, which I knew about, but moved it forward a year from 1939 to 1938. As you appreciate, Darrell, that's 1938 was a lot less sensitive. So he moves the camping trip before the Munich conference. In fact, it was August 39. Now, your listeners will not be surprised to hear, Darrell, that the Nazis weren't chasing the pink pound. Two gay British students, because Magnus was gay, along with Ted, two gay British students sharing a tent in Nazi Germany were going to attract attention. They obviously had very powerful protection, which came from Canaris. But more to the point, they were crossing the Polish-German frontier as Field Marshal von Kluge's, I think it was Field Marshal von Kluge and the two German army groups massed to invade Poland. There's no way they could have got through these very sensitive military areas with German troops camping all about, panzers queuing up, parked by the road. There's no way they would have been allowed as British students through highly sensitive military areas at a highly sensitive time as the Germans were about to invade Poland. So that's what Madron and Ted were up to. And eventually I befriended the very nice rent boy who had witnessed the Heath meeting and accompanied Heath to the drinks party with Heinrich Himmler, who was gay and who wanted to shag Ted. If you can use that expression, I appreciate this is a family program.
Oh, no, please.
Heinrich had rather taken a shine to Edward Heath and also wanted to recruit Ted Heath for the SS, knowing that he was already working for Admiral Canaris. So he basically wanted Ted Heath to report on Canaris's operation in Britain. And Ted didn't go along with that. He stayed out of the war as much as he could until the end, when it was clear Germany was losing. Then he didn't kill many Germans, but pretended to, got a military MBE organized by the Cabinet Office. He ran or was involved in, he basically ran a spy ring in Liverpool, which he set up. He moved away from Liverpool. Before he moved away, he set up a spy ring reporting on shipping movements. So the idea was to tell the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, when British convoys were sailing. And Heath set up a spy ring in Liverpool for that purpose. And they would report on escorts and the escort groups and morale, all the various bits of information the Kriegsmarine needed to know to prosecute the U-boat war. After the war, Heath he rose without trace. He wasn't that good. He rose without trace. He was appointed to conduct EEC negotiations by another German spy called Harold Macmillan, who the Germans had installed after Suez, having undermined patriotic, pro-British Anthony Eden, friend of a friend of several friends. And Heath then becomes effectively installed as the leader of the Tory party, and then becomes prime minister. The Germans actually installed him as prime minister as another German agent called Roy Jenkins ran a deflationary budget in 1970 with a view to undermining Harold Wilson, who had failed to get Britain into the EEC. Ted Heath had promised the Germans that he would take us in, and he did. There was a snag because his Chancellor of the Exchequer, Ian MacLeod, although he was pro-EEC, knew that the terms the Germans were imposing for entry were disastrous for the British economy. He therefore was opposed, so with the Treasury. So Ted recommended to the Germans that they had Ian MacLeod bumped off. He's the only British Prime Minister who's ever arranged to have his Chancellor of the Exchequer murdered. I mean, even Boris Johnson hasn't gone that far. I mean, he hasn't actually had Rishi Sunak murdered. They've had a few rows, but he hasn't actually had him bumped off. And Heath, as part of his dealings with German intelligence, was supplied with teenage boys by a paedophile ring run out of the Cabinet Office. The paedophile ring included John Hunt, the then Cabinet Secretary. And the Cabinet Office protected the man who ran the ring, who was the man you mentioned a few minutes ago, Jimmy Savile. He was